Okay, let's try to summarize Aristotle's political theory as how it was written in his seminal work, The Politics. So, how does Aristotle characterize politics? Well, fundamentally, for Aristotle, um, he looked at politics, or he analyzed politics systematically, and it pertains to his inquiry systematically, or to use a more modern terminology, scientifically, because he's basing his assumptions and his analysis on his empirical observations, right? That his politics, his book, is fundamentally a critical analysis based on empirical observation of the nature of a political community and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. Um, Again, for Aristotle, just like Plato, the purpose of a political community, of the polis, is basically human flourishing, right? So we have to, as much as we can, of course, we have to achieve the best form of government so that we can all flourish under it. And of course, these the polis, or this political community, basically is considered as uh, a place, or it's more than a place, it's a community where people come together, right? If you read your the politics, when in the nature and origin of the state, it says there, every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with the view of some good, for mankind always act in order to obtain that which they think good. So Aristotle believed that the reason why people conglomerate into forming political communities is because they want to achieve some kind of good. Otherwise, they would not have formed these communities, right? And for Aristotle, the polis, these political communities, are natural. Are natural. Remember that Aristotle is heavily influenced by his being an empiricist, or someone who uh, relies on empirical observation for critical analysis, right? And someone who does that, he sees that uh, there must be some good. Otherwise, why would you form these particular political communities if they are not aligned to what people think is good, right? And these political communities are natural. Not that they are natural because they are not man-made. They are man-made, but they are natural in the sense that they are a consequence, a natural consequence of the fact that human beings are political animals. So at the bottom of Aristotle's political theory lies his assumption that human beings are political animals. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that we are an animal who is politically motivated? No, no, no. That's not the case. For Aristotle, we are political animal because we can only achieve flourishing inside a political community. We can only achieve our highest potential as a rational being if we are inside a political community. If we are not living in a political community, we can never be considered as human beings. We will never be able to fully develop our capabilities as a human being, as a thinking and rational human being. And This is closely connected to human beings being rational, because our rationality will achieve its full blossoming only inside the political community. We cannot hide from the fact that we human beings require help coming from other people. From the moment we are born, from the moment we die, and what happened in between, it requires human beings helping each other. Right? All throughout our lives, we see us needing the help of other people. We cannot produce our own food, so we buy food in the market. And where do these vendors get the food that they're selling to us? From the farmers, from the fishermen, from the planters of vegetables and wheat and what have you. Right? We cannot do all these things all by our own. And not only that, we cannot fully achieve our intellectual capabilities if we are alone. It's impossible. It's entirely impossible. We won't be able to learn language, and without language, we will not be able to learn things. We will not be able to think. We will not be able to fully utilize our capacity to think. And so, Aristotle believed that human beings are political animals, because the political community where we live in is a natural consequence of human beings trying to achieve its full potential, to use the language of Aristotle, to achieve its form. And that can only be achieved inside a political community. Aristotle, of course, also tried to, in a way, um, say that slavery is actually something natural, and even women's subordination is actually something that is natural. You see, this could be a kind of flaw from Aristotle's way of thinking, because as I've told you, Aristotle looks into the nature of things. He looks into the processes, the natural order, the natural laws that govern things, based from observation. And of course, during the time, what can he observe? He observed slavery, and as a matter of fact, a great deal of the economy of each state or city-state is basically a direct consequence of slavery, right? Women are considered to be a kind of second-grade citizens because, according to Aristotle, their nature is not as perfect as that of men. Right? And so therefore, it's a natural consequence that women should be under the authority of men. Although women are capable of being rational, but their form is somehow incomplete. It lacks authority, unlike that of men. Of course, Aristotle is basing this from what he saw, from what he observed. The same with slavery, right? Aristotle believed that there are people who are strong and there are people who are not as strong but are intelligent and, intellectually capable. And so, when you look at the nature of slaves, Aristotle will say, they're not really capable of rational thinking. If they are, that's very limited, right? And so therefore, it's just natural for these types of people to be slaves. And as a matter of fact, these slaves could also live a good life if they will be led by a virtuous master, right? On their own, these slaves, since they are not as fully capable as that of their masters, they could not actually live a good life, right? But with the care of a virtuous master, these slaves can actually live a good life. And even women can live a good life if they are under the authority of virtuous men, right? That's what, of course, that could be a controversial, but as I've told you, Aristotle is looking at, empirical observation and is trying to deduce things, his critical analysis of politics from his empirical observation of what was happening. And this is a direct product of that kind of thinking. It may be controversial, it may be problematic, but this is the same way of thinking that Aristotle used to study comparative politics. Right? When it comes to Aristotle's critique of Plato, well, it's not really that good. Many scholars are saying somehow Aristotle has forgotten Plato. Aristotle will say, of course, Aristotle will believe that private property is important in order for people to function well. They need private property so that they can enjoy their life, so they can continue thinking, so that they can have leisure. Because for Aristotle, leisure is needed so that you can develop your more higher faculties. And of course, Aristotle will say, according to Plato, private property is not important. He would not allow private property. But I think the main mistake of Aristotle here is that Plato was merely talking about the guardian class. Right? It would not be allowed for the guardian class, the philosopher kings, and the auxiliaries to own properties or private property, so that they would fully devote their lives to the welfare of the state. But the producers, which constitute majority of the people in the state, are allowed to have private property. Perhaps Aristotle have forgotten that in his critique of Plato. Now, the study of politics or political theory for Aristotle is actually practical wisdom together with ethics. So his study of the proper course of action, the proper decision making, how can we achieve virtue, how can we know what is right from what is wrong, and how can we do this. That's his ethical theory. Political theory, on the other hand, studies the natures and consequences of political regimes or political constitutions, as you would call it. Political constitutions or regimes are broad. They're not just simply limited to government, but they include the way people think about their government, their opinion about what is right and wrong, their political culture, the economic orientation of the state, the distribution of goods, etc. So all of this is a part of a regime or a constitution. And political theory for Aristotle is a study of the nature of the constitution of the regime and its consequences, and how can governments be reformed, right? How can constitutions be reformed so that it would become better and more suitable to help people achieve flourishing. So these are practical sciences for Aristotle, meaning to say they're a kind of science that is not achieved for its own sake, or it's not learned for its own sake, just like theoretical philosophy, so to speak. But it's a kind of knowledge that is considered to be a means to an end, an instrumental knowledge, so that we can achieve the good life, so that we can achieve eudaimonia or human flourishing. So both his ethical theory and political theory goes hand in hand, so that a person, and of course, with that being said, including the community, the entire political community, can achieve its goal, which is eudaimonia or human flourishing. Of course, Aristotle believed that the state originated in the household, in families, right? Basically for the purpose of obtaining the necessary needs for everyday sustenance or survival. And then of course, that is not enough, right? And so the village is formed. There are many households, and from them emerges the village. Now, it's more sophisticated than a simple household, but its purpose is still for the sustenance of the people, for easier access to survival necessities, or the things that we need so that we can survive. And then it goes on, became more complicated, has evolved into the polis, or the state. When these several villages, they combine, they are large enough to be nearly quite self-sufficient, right? When this community becomes self-sufficient, it becomes a polis, it becomes a state, right? And with this, the state is not merely, it's not merely for sustaining physical life, but it's also about nourishing other human faculties, other human capabilities, so that human beings can truly flourish. Another important thing for Aristotle is citizenship. Since he was also heavily influenced by the polis, by how the inner workings of the polis, just like Plato, Aristotle believed that citizenship should involve citizens who are more active in the life of the community. But this depends on the kind of regime or constitution the polis or the state has, because different regimes or different constitutions entail different kinds of virtues or different kinds of citizenships, right? Different kinds of what constitute a good citizen. So it varies according to the constitution, right? And according to Aristotle, a good citizen, let's say in a democracy, could be a bad citizen in an oligarchy. Or a good citizen in an oligarchy could be a bad citizen in a democracy. So it depends, right? It depends on the kind of regime. But the thing is, what is important for Aristotle is that these citizens must partake in the life of the state. And it involves ruling and being ruled, right? So that's Aristotle's notion of citizenship. Now, Aristotle believed that what is needed to govern the state is unlike what Plato believed. For Plato, it has to be governed by the philosopher kings, whose primary activity is to do philosophy or to know philosophia. For Aristotle, that's not the case. For Aristotle, philosophia is not needed. Philosophia for Aristotle is something that is connected to a more higher kind of thinking, a kind of knowledge that is pursued for its own sake. Not practical knowledge, but human flourishing can actually be achieved through the use of practical wisdom. And so, what is needed, according to Aristotle, is not knowledge of philosophy, but phronesis, or practical wisdom. It represents the intellectual virtue that enables proper moral decision-making in particular circumstances. So, phronesis is this capability to understand what's happening and based from the different circumstances, evaluates, judges what is moral and what is immoral given these certain facts that are involved. So therefore, there is no one-size-fits-all right thing to do or bad thing to do. It depends on the circumstances. And practical wisdom is a characteristic of a ruler, according to Aristotle. Right? A good ruler for Aristotle must possess practical wisdom. And so he would call this ruler of the state to possess practical wisdom as a great souled man, or a megalopsychos. Someone was a great soul, so to speak. Right? And for Aristotle, this great souled man exhibits moral excellence and deserves honor. Okay. Now, let's go to Aristotle's analysis, actual analysis of states, which could be his greatest contribution to political theory and to political science itself. Because as I've told you, Aristotle was the first one to do comparative politics by analyzing 158 actual regimes or constitutions throughout the ancient world. And he was able to build a large resource material for political science research. And from this, he was able to deduce three forms of good regimes and their perversion. For Aristotle, a regime is good or a government is good if the rulers are considering the welfare or the interest of the entire state. And it becomes perverse or bad when these rulers are not thinking about the welfare of the state, but are just simply concerned with serving their own self-interests. So, for Aristotle, based from his 158 constitutions, he tried to classify them into the number of rulers. Ruled by one, ruled by a few, and ruled by many. The good form of a government that is ruled by one is called monarchy. And the perverse form of that government, or the bad form of that government, is tyranny. When it comes to rule of the few, it's aristocracy. And when aristocracy is perverted, it becomes an oligarchy. And with the classification of rule of the many, it's called polity. And its perversion, Aristotle called democracy. Now, when it comes to Aristotle's political analysis, wealth or the economy or economic activities plays a crucial part. This is, I think, one of the things that we can actually get from Aristotle is that he sees politics as not just simply ruling or being ruled, but it's also about the economic orientation of the state. It's also about the wealth owned by the people. It's also about how many of the citizens are wealthy and how many are not wealthy or how many are poor. If there are many who are poor, there will be consequences. If there are few who are wealthy, there will be consequences. Right? And so we can even say that Aristotle's analysis of politics is heavily reliant on his analysis of wealth. For Aristotle, wealth is more important than number. Only wealth helps to explain how a given political system functions. Sabi nga ni Aristotle, it is inevitable that there should be an oligarchy where the rulers, whether they are few or many, owe their position to riches. And it is equally inevitable that there should be democracy where the poor rule. You see, Aristotle's analysis of these 158 constitutions led him to the conclusion that it's very difficult to find good forms of government. Most of the time, we find bad forms of government. It is also to be noted that Aristotle saw or concluded that one of the problems in this political regime is that it's always unstable. There is always a kind of social unrest brought about by economic inequalities. Aristotle was able to see that. And for Aristotle, for the most part, what we can see are oligarchic regimes and democratic regimes. Both perverted forms. Because oligarchy is the perverted form of aristocracy, while democracy is the perverted form of polity. Right? And when rulers owe their possession to riches, then oligarchy becomes inescapable, right? When the poor rule, then what's the natural consequence? Then the regime is definitely would become a democracy, right? Now, when it comes to oligarchies, okay, these are the cities ruled by the rich. So therefore, political power is exercised by the rich, and of political authority is decided by wealth, right? That's what an oligarchy is. The wealthy dominate. And one of the characteristics of an oligarchy, according to Aristotle, is basically wealth is a requirement for political office, right? In oligarchic political institutions, property qualifications are required for political offices. Now, there are many kinds of oligarchies in the way that there are many kinds of democracies. Aristotle is always emphasizing that there's no one size fits all, right? We cannot say that one oligarchy is the same with all other oligarchies, or one democracy is the same with all other democracies. No, that's not the case. Okay? Each polis or each state have their different political and economic dynamics. And if you want to reform, because as I've told you, Aristotle believed that one of the main goals for political theory is political reform. If you want to reform, then therefore, you have to take into consideration these inner workings, these inner dynamics that are specific to each state. There's no single formula for political reform. Now, returning to oligarchies, when it comes to justice, for Aristotle, he believed in a kind of distributive justice. Okay, a kind of justice that is actually, political offices or political authority is not based on wealth, or is not based on freedom or equality, but it's actually based on virtue. Right? That's what real justice for Aristotle is. Now, when it comes to oligarchies, they have a kind of, justice, but it's incomplete. Because, as I told you, in an oligarchic regime, political offices or political power is distributed by means of property qualifications or wealth. And for the oligarchs, or in an oligarchy, they will tend to think that political authority is suitable to those who are wealthy, right? So in a way, it's saying that superiority comes from property, or superiority comes from wealth. And since the oligarchs are wealthy and the poor do not have property, it's just but right to put oligarchs, the elites, in power. Now, in a way, Aristotle would say there's a kind of justice there, but it's not justice, really. It's incomplete. Right? Because the oligarchs are saying that, they are superior because we are wealthy. But the thing is, that's just wealth. There are other factors that you have to consider. Right? There are other factors. So it is false for you to think that you are superior simply because you are superior in just one aspect, which is property. Right? So it falls short according to Aristotle. Because real justice, the goal of which is to inculcate to the polis virtue. That's how we can truly flourish. So, in a good city, according to Aristotle, the superior people, who are basically not superior in wealth, but superior in virtue. So basically, these are the people who possess practical wisdom. They have phronesis. And with this, they can know what virtue is, because for Aristotle, virtue lies in the golden mean, right? So only these people who possess practical wisdom can understand what virtue is. And these people of superior virtue must be the one to lead the state in a good city, according to Aristotle. Right? But that's not the case in an oligarchy. That's also not the case in a democracy. Right? Because, the arguments of the oligarchs is that, we are different from the poor because we're healthy. Right? We're wealthy. For the poor, on the other hand, they don't really care about wealth because they do not possess them. What they care about is freedom. We want more freedom. The poor people want more freedom. The elites want more wealth. And definitely, this creates a kind of tension. And Aristotle saw that this tension is basically what's creating political instability. So for Aristotle, political reform is, of course, moving towards a better kind of government. But not only that, political reform also aims to provide a more stable government, a more stable regime. Now, let's talk about democracies. For Aristotle, democracies is a regime that is ruled by the poor. And one of the characteristics of a democratic regime is that, it's a kind of political systems that heavily relies on lottery or draw lots. So a lottery system allots political office entirely on the basis of chance. Because, in a democracy, what is really important, there is equality. Equality in terms of what? Equality in terms of citizenship. So if we are all citizens of a particular state, then we are equal with each other. Whether we are rich or we are poor, wealth does not really count. What really matters is that we are a citizen of this particular polis, and therefore we have equal right to govern. We have equal right to share in political authority. That's where draw lots come in. Right? That's where draw lots come in. Because for democracy, elections highly favor the rich. Right? Because how can the poor campaign? Right? Elections highly favor the rich, the wealthy, and the well-known. But that's not what's really the value in a democracy. The value in a democracy is freedom and equality, right? And it is based from citizenship. Another factor that Aristotle saw in democracies is the democratic assembly. So when it comes to policy making, when it comes to providing decisions for the state, people come together, just like in Athens, right? People come together to decide on these public issues. And there's even a stipend. The state will even pay these people who come together to participate, to discuss important issues within the state. Right? They will even pay them because, if there's no payment, then the poor would not go because they have to work. Only the rich can go. So therefore, it can become based on, political power can become based on wealth. But that should not be the case in a democracy. So we draw lots for political office, for political authority, and then we go to public assemblies, and then we debate as citizens, and after that we get a stipend. We get paid. So that for that particular day's work, we would be exempted. We won't need to work. Right? But then again, Aristotle said that democracy failed when it comes to achieving true justice. Because what's the fault of the values of democracy is that they assume that equality in one aspect is equality in all aspects. But that's not the case. We all know for a fact that that's not true. Even if we are all citizens, it's not necessary that we are equal with all aspects. The same with oligarchy. They believe that they have superiority because they're wealthy, right? But superiority is not just simply being evaluated by wealth alone. That could be one of the factors, but certainly not the only one. When it comes to democracy, what's important is equality based on citizenship. But the thing is, we're not really equal just simply because of citizenship. Right? There are other things to be considered. So both democracy and oligarchy failed to comply with the standard of distributive justice that Aristotle wants to bring forth in a just city. Because the true principle of distributive justice in a just city or in a good society, which political offices were assigned on the basis of virtue. Right? Because these people who would hold political office will become the decision makers for the entire state. They must know what virtue is. And how can they do that if they don't know practical wisdom? If they don't understand ethics, if they don't understand politics, they would never be able to do that. Okay? And in that particular just city, it would be devoted to inculcation of virtue. And this purpose would be seen in all of its parts. Right? That's why, democracy, according to Plato, might be the most beautiful of cities. Because there's variation, different people doing different things. But because it does not promote virtue of all members, Aristotle will say, democracy is a corrupt form of regime. And so, what's the solution now? Right? What's the solution now? It's really very by his analysis of 158 constitutions, Aristotle saw that most of the time it's just oligarchy and democracy. And both oligarchy and democracy are, not really good. And so, what's the alternative? Right? Aristotle will provide an alternative. A kind of a realizable state. A state that can be achieved. Although this realizable state may not be considered to be a best form of government, like in the leagues of monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. Right? But it's the best that we could have. It's kind of the next best thing to these best forms of government. It may not be good, but it would allow stability. Remember that Aristotle's political reform aims toward political stability. And the tension comes from the friction between the rich and the poor. The rich wants more wealth. The poor wants more freedom. And these wants basically clash against each other, which tends to be the harbinger of chaos in the state. And Aristotle would not want that. He would want stability in the state, because we cannot live a good life if we're living in a very unstable political environment. How can we live a good life? How can we flourish in these unstable political environments? Okay, and so the next best thing Aristotle would call a mixed regime, or a mixed constitution, or a middle constitution. In some of your reading materials, you may encounter it as polity, but do not confuse it with the kind of polity which is the best form of the rule of the many. Right? That could be a bit confusing. That's why I will not use the word polity anymore. Instead, I would interchange using the word mixed regimes or mixed constitution. Right? Or sometimes I could even say middle constitution. They're all the same. I would no longer use the word polity as to not to confuse you. Right? So, we can do political reform. And how can we do that? By combining the aspects of oligarchy and democracy. Here, once again, we will encounter Aristotle's orientation of the golden mean. Aristotle's perspective on what counts as virtuous lies in a golden mean. So, you cannot be on the extremes of the spectrum. Oligarchy and democracy are at the extremes of the spectrum. And so they are considered to be vices. They are considered to be either lacking or in excess. So we have to be in the middle. That's why, it's called middle constitution or mixed regimes or mixed constitution. Right? So it's a combination of some aspects of oligarchy and some aspects of democracy. And in the process, we are limiting the dangerous tendency of an oligarchy, and we're also regulating or limiting the dangerous tendency of the democracy. So where does this dangerous tendency come from? In an oligarchy, this dangerous tendency comes from its elites who are ruling for their own interests, and what really matters is for these wealthy rulers to become more wealthy, right? And the bad side of the democracy is that people want more freedom, right? More and more freedom without wanting virtue, etc. And political authority is distributed through through these means. So those are two extremes. So we have to limit these tendencies so that little by little we could arrive at a kind of golden mean, an average, something in between. Now, again, there is no one size fits all. This requires, once again, the capabilities of someone who possesses practical wisdom to know the proper political reform to be conducted given the peculiarities of that particular community. Because communities are different from each other. They have different needs, they have different kinds of people, they are different kinds of economic orientation, and so on and so forth, right? And so this political reform of trying to tame oligarchic tendencies and tame democratic tendencies will be dependent on the evaluation of someone who's practical wisdom, right? Because it's a case-to-case basis. There's no such thing as one size fits all, no general formula so that we can limit. In some instances, we could limit the property requirement. There could be some offices that require property requirements, but there are some which does not, right? And the freedom of the people could also be limited, right? Or let's say there could be some offices that are chosen based from draw lots, while others is based from property qualifications. So these types of combination, right? That's why it's called middle constitution. It is up to the duty of a statesman who is endowed with practical wisdom to know how to reform. Another important feature of this mixed regime that Aristotle is talking about is the dominance of a third class of people. In oligarchy, the elites dominate. In a democracy, the poor dominate. But there's a third class, the middle class. They're not as rich as the oligarchs, and they're not as poor as the poor ruling in a democracy. They may not have the tendency of the oligarchs to be too protective on their wealth. The oligarchs are always protecting their wealth. They don't want the poor, to share their wealth. The poor, on the other hand, they're always so protective of their freedoms, right? So once again, Aristotle opted for a balance, right? So Aristotle saw that in his analysis of 158 constitutions, he saw that the more stable political communities are actually communities that have a large middle class. Communities with a large middle class, Aristotle saw, are more stable compared to pure oligarchies or pure democracies. When the elites have power, that's not stable because the poor will always try to pull away that power from them. When the poor have power, then the elites would always try to take power from the poor because they believe they are superior. The poor, on the other hand, believe that they're all equal because they're all citizens of the state. So it's gonna be a friction. There's gonna be a friction, and that's not good. It would create revolutions, political upheavals. That kind of environment is not good for human flourishing, right? But if there is a strong and considerable number of people who belong to the middle class, then it will be more stable, right? So we can say that an oligarchy is ruled by the rich, democracy is ruled by the few, a mixed regime is ruled by the middle class, right? And you see, in the middle class, it's a good combination of many things. Not on the extreme of wealth and not on the extreme of poverty, right? It's a kind of, a good vantage point, seeing many things that the elites would not see and the poor would not see, because the elites are too focused on, protecting and gaining more wealth, protecting their wealth and gaining more wealth, while the poor are so concerned with, how can they expand their freedoms. But the middle class, they're in the middle, not on the extremes. And so when it comes to decision making, when it comes to practical wisdom, they're more likely to possess it because they have a vantage point of, these different perspectives. So it's less likely that a mixed regime would lead into a class warfare, which has heavily been the cause of, the political frictions in the ancient world, as Aristotle observed. Right? According to Aristotle, that the city will be more stable only if the forces favoring the constitution are stronger than those opposing it. And he would rely on the middle class because they want stability, right? To be, to someone who would favor the constitution, right? And when the middle class is the ruling class, then it would be better for everyone. Because the middle class do not covet the possessions of the others, right? The poor could covet the possession of others because they would want more freedom. The middle class is more preferable to the rich, right? Because, they're not overprotective of their possessions. So cities, according to Aristotle, that has a large middle class are more stable. That's kind of, an endowment for these cities. Large states which has large middle class is more viable for the kind of political reform that Aristotle was espousing. Now, if we look at Aristotle's analysis of states, basically he used comparative politics, very sophisticated kind of, a comparison of different political regimes. It's more economic than political in the sense that it's actually the economic mechanisms within the polis that influences the political outcomes in the polis. And Aristotle focuses on the improvement or political reform. Okay? So with that, I would end our discussions on the political theory of Aristotle.